May 23rd, 1939. The USS Squalus dives for a routine test, just like it had done dozens of times before. This time, something goes wrong. A valve fails. Cold ocean water floods the engine room in seconds. The submarine sinks 240 feet to the ocean floor. 26 men are dead almost instantly. 33 are still alive, trapped in the dark, in freezing cold, with limited air at the bottom of the Atlantic. No one had ever survived a rescue from this depth. It had never been done before. This is the story of the longest 39 hours in United States naval history, and the one man who refused to accept that these men were already gone. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what the USS Squalus was. She was brand new. Commissioned only months earlier, in March of 1939, she was one of the most advanced submarines in the United States Navy. Sleek, modern, built at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire. The Navy was proud of her. The crew was proud to serve on her. Submarines in this era were still, in many ways, experimental machines. Sailors sometimes called submarine duty the coffin service. A dark joke, but one rooted in real danger. A submarine is, after all, a sealed metal tube designed to sink on purpose and then rise again. Every dive was an act of trust. Trust in the engineering, trust in the crew, trust in dozens of valves and hatches that all had to work exactly as intended. That morning, the Squalus was scheduled for one of its final test dives before being declared fully operational. 59 men were aboard, a mix of experienced Navy officers and younger enlisted sailors, some barely out of their teens. For most of them, this was simply another day of routine work. They had done crash dives before. They knew the drill. Lieutenant Oliver Naquin commanded the vessel. Confident, experienced, well-liked by his crew. There was no reason, on paper, to expect that this dive would be any different from the ones before it. At 8:40 in the morning, the order was given. The Squalus began her descent. For the first few seconds, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The submarine systems checked out. The crew moved through their positions with practiced calm. Then, the main induction valve, a large valve responsible for supplying air to the engines while the submarine ran near the surface, failed to close properly. Seawater began pouring in. It happened fast. Faster than most of the men on board could process. The aft, the rear section of the submarine, home to the engine rooms, began flooding almost immediately. Thousands of gallons of freezing Atlantic seawater rushed in through the failed valve, filling the compartments within moments. The men working in the engine rooms had almost no warning. Some tried to seal the watertight doors between compartments. A desperate, practiced motion meant to contain flooding and save the rest of the ship. Several of them succeeded. It cost them their lives. By sealing the doors from the correct side, they trapped themselves in the flooding compartments so that the men forward could survive. In less than a minute, the aft third of the submarine was completely lost. 26 men in the engine rooms and after torpedo room died within moments, some by drowning, others by the sheer, sudden physical shock of the freezing water. Forward. In the control room and the bow compartments, the remaining 33 men felt the submarine lurch, then tilt, then begin to sink. Not gently, but rapidly, uncontrollably, toward the ocean floor. There was no time for fear to fully register. There was only procedure. Blow the ballast tanks. Try to surface. Seal every compartment that could still be sealed. None of it worked. The Squalus came to rest on the seafloor, 240 feet below the surface. deeper than any successful submarine rescue had ever been attempted in history. Inside, 33 men sat in near-total darkness, water dripping through stressed seams, breathing air that was already beginning to grow stale. They were alive, but they had no way of knowing in that moment whether anyone on the surface even knew they were still down there. On the surface, the submarine tender USS Squalus, a sister vessel testing alongside the Squalus that same morning, noticed something wrong almost immediately. Squalus had stopped responding. A marker buoy released automatically from the sunken submarine eventually broke the surface, along with a telephone line meant for exactly this kind of emergency. Through that thin cable, the men trapped below were finally able to speak to the surface. They were alive. They were trapped. They needed help, and no one anywhere had ever rescued men from this deep before. Inside the submarine, conditions grew worse by the hour. The temperature dropped steadily. The surrounding seawater was cold enough that within hours, the interior felt like a refrigerator. Men wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing and blanket they could find. They stopped moving more than necessary, both to conserve body heat and to conserve the air itself, which was growing thinner and more toxic with every breath they took. Carbon dioxide levels rose slowly, silently, dangerously. In excess, it causes confusion, headaches, and eventually unconsciousness. A threat just as real as the cold or the darkness. The crew used canisters of soda lime to try to absorb the buildup, rationing their movements, trying to stay calm, trying not to think too hard about how much time they might actually have left. They had no idea what was happening above them. They didn't know if a rescue was even possible. They didn't know if anyone on the surface had ever attempted anything like this before. The truth was, no one had. Deep-sea submarine rescue at this depth existed only in theory. It existed in the mind of one naval officer in particular, a man who had spent years building something almost no one else believed would ever be needed or would ever actually work. His name was Charles Swede Mommsen. Mommsen was, by most accounts, an unusual figure in the Navy. An engineer and inventor as much as a career officer. Years earlier, after witnessing the aftermath of an earlier submarine disaster, he had become almost obsessed with a single question. If a submarine sank in deep water, was there truly no way to bring the crew back alive? Most of his colleagues believed the answer was no. Depths beyond a certain point were simply considered unsurvivable for rescue purposes. Mommsen refused to accept that answer. For years, largely on his own initiative, he designed and tested what became known as the McCann Rescue Chamber, a diving bell-like device that could be lowered on a cable, attach itself to a submarine's escape hatch using a rubber seal, and allow trapped sailors to climb through, compartments sealed from the ocean the entire time. It had been tested. It had worked in controlled conditions, but it had never been used in a real emergency, at real depth, with real lives on the line. Now, it would have to be. Mommsen and his team raced to the site of the sinking. The rescue chamber was lowered inch by inch through 240 feet of dark, frigid Atlantic water. A process that took hours, not minutes, with every cable, every seal, every mechanism needing to function perfectly on the first real attempt. The first descent connected successfully. The chamber sealed against the submarine's forward hatch. The hatch opened from inside. One by one, in small groups, exhausted, freezing, barely able to stand after so many hours in the cold and stale air, The trapped men climbed into the chamber and were slowly, carefully winched back toward the surface. It took multiple trips. Hours passed between each one. The weather on the surface grew worse, complicating an already unprecedented operation. Every single trip carried the risk that something, a cable, a seal, a piece of equipment never before tested under this kind of pressure, could fail. None of them did. After 39 hours trapped at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, the last of the 33 survivors reached the surface alive. It remains, to this day, one of the deepest successful submarine rescues in naval history. 26 men were lost that morning. Men who, in many cases, gave their final moments trying to protect their shipmates by sealing the very doors that doomed them. Their sacrifice is part of this story too, and it should never be forgotten. But 33 men who by every existing understanding of the time should not have survived, did survive. Because one officer spent years building something almost no one believed would ever be needed. Because a rescue chamber, tested only in calm conditions, worked exactly as intended under the worst conditions imaginable. The Squalus herself was eventually raised from the ocean floor months later, an extraordinary engineering effort in its own right. She was repaired, recommissioned under a new name, the USS Sailfish, and went on to serve through the Second World War. The rescue chamber Momsen built became standard equipment on submarine tenders for decades afterward. The techniques developed and proven that day saved lives in emergencies that followed on vessels and in navies far beyond the one that built it. 39 hours, 240 feet down, 33 men who waited in the cold and the dark, not knowing if anyone was coming, and one man who had already decided years before that morning that he would not let the answer be no. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. Every week, we bring you true stories of survival and the darker moments of history that deserve to be remembered. A like helps this story reach more people who might appreciate it too. And if you want to make sure you never miss the next one, tap that notification bell. I'd love to know what you thought and which story you'd like to hear next. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with us.